The Marvel Cinematic Universe, or the MCU, is a highly successful and interconnected franchise of superhero films and TV shows. It's based on the characters from Marvel Comics, and it's one of the most expansive and financially successful franchises in cinematic history. The MCU officially began with the release of Iron Man in 2008, which was a critical and commercial success. And the success of this movie paved the way for more films in the MCU, including Thor, Captain America, and The Avengers, which brought together the major characters for the first time. The Avengers was a groundbreaking film, not only for its epic crossover event, but again for its financial and critical success, grossing over $1.5 billion worldwide. The MCU continued to expand with the major introduction of new characters like Black Panther, Doctor Strange, and the Guardians of the Galaxy. Then came Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame, which served as the culmination of a decade-long narrative, with Endgame becoming the highest-grossing film of all time. So needless to say, these movies have cemented the MCU as a cultural phenomenon. With Marvel's reigning dominance in both the superhero space and just media in general, it seemed like they were almost untouchable. But in addition to things like superhero fatigue and repetitive formulas, many people have started turning against Marvel. And there can be a lot of reasons for this, but a strong sentiment amongst many Marvel fans is that Marvel has become too woke. And in this video, we'll be exploring just that. Now, before we dive deeper into this topic, we have to first define exactly what wokeness is. So the original meaning of the word woke just meant that you were aware of things that were going on in society. It meant that you weren't sleeping. It meant that you had your eyes open to things like racism, sexism, or really just the broader societal issues. But now the word has just become kind of a lazy catch-all term for anything that's considered progressive, or anything that just goes against what was always considered culturally normal. The way that I'm going to define wokeness in this video is the way that I think most people tend to see it. It's basically being progressive to the point where it's absurd. So for example, when people say things like, exercising and eating healthy are fat-phobic, or the color green is inherently racist, I think of that as being woke. Just a very silly, kind of stupid, overly progressive thing. Or when people are progressive but in a very disingenuous way, more when it's done as virtue signaling and moral grandstanding. So when I refer to wokeness, this is what I'm referring to. Just like many other entertainment brands out there, Marvel has started incorporating more diverse and socially conscious themes in their recent TV shows and movies. In 2018, we got our first Black Panther film, and it was celebrated for its groundbreaking portrayal of African culture and its predominantly black cast. The movie addressed themes of African identity, colonialism, and the responsibilities of those who have power and privilege. We've gotten characters like Captain Marvel, Marvel's first film to feature a female superhero as the lead. And that film promotes themes like female empowerment and challenging gender stereotypes. There was The Eternals, which introduced the first openly gay superhero in the MCU. It also featured the first Pakistani character and the first deaf superhero. Shang-Chi featured the first Asian superhero and had a majority Asian cast. So Marvel has definitely made strides to combat the view that their stories just feature generic white guys as the lead. And I do have to say, for the most part, I think this is a good thing. More diversity can lead to richer and more varied storytelling. However, the issue that most people have isn't simply the addition of more diverse characters. It's when that diversity is done in a very performative and inauthentic way, and when studios are clearly just pandering to their audience rather than focusing on imaginative storytelling. Let's look at Captain Marvel, for example. Captain Marvel was promoted with a very feminist message, and Brie Larson, as an actress and as a vocal advocate for gender equality in Hollywood, she became the symbol for this film's message. So naturally, some viewers felt that the theme's marketing was overly political, and that led to concerns about whether or not the movie would be overly preachy and agenda-driven. And Brie Larson came under fire several times for different comments that she made, and just coming across as very arrogant, condescending, and unlikable in interviews. So when you have an actress who's perceived this way in real life, and you mix that with a generic story that heavily leads into pandering feminism, that's definitely a recipe for people not liking your film. And oftentimes when films like this are unsuccessful, the narrative becomes that people just didn't like it because they don't want to see a woman as the lead. And this type of thinking is exactly what frustrates the audience. It's become commonplace now for studios just to say, well, racism, sexism, or really just any other ism just so they can evade personal responsibility. A portion of the audience felt that the film's nonlinear storytelling and complex structure made it hard to follow. Some said they just didn't like Brie Larson's performance and felt that it was hollow and flat. And then there's the reality that Captain Marvel was released shortly before Avengers Endgame, one of the most highly anticipated films in the MCU. So for some people, the film just didn't feel as exciting when compared to what they knew was coming later. But when you have a studio that just says, well, people didn't like it because sexism and anti-womanhood, again, that frustrates the audience. Because wokeness dictates that any kind of criticism is null and void simply because of the positive representation of play. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't one of my favorites, and like most MCU films, I watched it again on Disney Plus, and I thought it was fine. But just because it didn't wow me like some of the other movies did, this doesn't mean I hated the film simply because feminism and girl power equals bad. I personally loved the first Black Panther film. It was entertaining, I loved the music, and it touched on deeper themes that I felt were super important. It also became a cultural movement in the Black community, with people turning out en masse to go see this film. But as much as I love this film, I can still respect the legitimate criticism thrown at it. It's an MCU film at the end of the day, so of course it followed a very familiar superhero movie plot structure. The hero faces both internal and external challenges and eventually overcomes them to save the day, which usually culminates in a battle where the hero has to fight an evil version of themselves. We've seen that in many other MCU movies. I also didn't like the part with the rhinos at the end. I felt the CGI was passable at best, and the train fight looked very much like an unfinished video game cutscene. And I say that as someone who loved this movie, but it became this movie that no one was allowed to criticize simply because it had an all-black cast. Because once again, wokeness dictates that if you didn't like Black Panther or if you were critical, that means racism. Another example of this is the Eternals. Before this movie came out, all I kept seeing in the marketing was the cast and crew talking about how diverse this film would be, and they focused very heavily on the fact that they had a female director who was also a woman of color. They talked so much about how this was going to be so different from any other Marvel film we've seen. I actually looked forward to this film for quite a long time and I had high hopes. But as I sat there in the theater, I was a little bored and disappointed. Now don't get me wrong, I enjoyed the movie, but I felt that it was a little convoluted. I felt like it went on too long. I felt that the pacing was a little bit slow. They had so many cool concepts and things that they introduced, but I just felt that the execution clearly wasn't there. I had many legitimate criticisms for this film, and none of it was about the characters being gay, none of it was about a character being black, none of it was about a character being deaf. It was simply that there were too many characters, pacing issues, and the fact that certain things happened in this movie that should have been major world-changing events. But after the movie, they never even bothered to mention or even follow up on some of those things. And I wasn't the only one who felt this way because reportedly, this was one of the lowest rated and lowest grossing films in Marvel's history. Let's look at She-Hulk, Marvel's controversial Disney Plus series. Now, this was meant to be a fun and lighthearted legal drama that frequently broke the fourth wall. The main character is Jennifer Walters, who's the Hulk's cousin, and after an accident, she ends up gaining her own Hulk powers. So I just took this show for what it was, a very self-aware and lighthearted comedy that doesn't take itself too seriously. But one of the main critiques for the show is that it frequently throws in all these social issues and portrays men as either creeps or bumbling idiots. When Bruce Banner got his Hulk powers, for example, he had to work for years and learn how to control them. He practiced, he did scientific experiments on himself, and after going through his journey, he finally became the best version of himself. But when Jennifer gets her powers, she's good at everything almost immediately. She doesn't really have to work on honing her skills, she's just automatically awesome, and even acts as if she's better than Bruce in many instances. The MCU is so big and so vast with many different characters, so I think it's perfectly fine that maybe I'm just not the main demographic for this show. I don't need everything to be for me, I don't have to relate to every single character, and I certainly don't have to watch. But many of the themes and jokes in this show are just so on the nose, so heavy-handed. And for a show that seems to be all about female empowerment and how men are idiots who over-sexualize women, this show sure does focus quite a lot on her looks and her body. Now look, I get that this is a TV show, this is fantasy, this is Hollywood, but I'm just saying, it's kind of funny and hypocritical where they demonize men and say that they over-sexualize women, but then this show turns around and does just that. So what is it that people actually have a problem with? Well, as a Marvel fan, I can tell you that we don't like the moral grandstanding and corporate virtue signaling. I do commend Marvel for trying to do something different. I commend them for having different genres, and for wanting to include more serious themes in their stories. But I don't like the fact that a lot of these issues feel crowbarred in. We don't want derivative characters who are just boring, watered down versions of others. Like, what if Iron Man was a young black woman? Or what if Captain America was black? I don't have a problem with Captain America being black, but I don't really want to see Falcon taking up that mantle. He's already an established superhero in his own right. We don't need characters whose only defining character trait is their marginalized identity. We don't want movies that are actually just long trailers for their next upcoming movies. I get that each of these movies is basically like a chapter in a much bigger story, but each movie still has to stand alone and be good in its own right. I mean, when I saw the most recent Ant-Man film, the film just felt rushed with a bunch of plot holes and a very abrupt ending that served more as a way to set up the next installment. And that brings me to my next point, which is something that I always harp on the importance of: good storytelling. As human beings, we love great stories. Stories entertain us, they inspire us, they teach us lessons. But many of these movies and TV shows that Marvel has been churning out lately, they feel more like a lecture. And at many points, it almost feels like they stop the show for the character to stand on a soapbox and give you a speech. They practically turn to the camera and tell you everything that's wrong with society and everything that's wrong with you. We want characters with growth. For example, when Tony Stark was first introduced, he was meant to be a very arrogant playboy, and while lovable, he was also meant to be kind of an unlikable guy. But what endears us to his character is the fact that we see his journey. We see him grow, we see him overcome obstacles, we see him go from this overgrown man-child to being a loving father and hero. But would we still like Tony just as much if he was always perfect? Because with many of these strong female characters, they're just seen as already being perfect, not having to change, and not having to go through the same hero's journey, and quite frankly, this can be very boring. Now, at the time of making this video, the next MCU movie to be released will be The Marvels, a movie that features 3 strong female leads, 2 of them being women of color. And so far, from everything that I've been hearing, there have been very negative test screenings, there have been conflicts on set, and they hired an inexperienced director who doesn't know the source material. Now, I hope that this movie is good. This movie may come out and it may be the best thing Marvel has ever made. But with everything I'm hearing, it doesn't seem like that's going to be the case. And it's saying that they're going to lose millions on this film, but I guess we'll see. At the end of the day, Marvel is a big corporation. They're a business, and while movies are definitely a form of artistic expression, they also need to make a profit. So if diversity and inclusion are the trends, and that's what people want to see in their movies, then Marvel's going to continue doing anything that they think will make them more money. But the most important thing is making sure that the story remains priority. That simply race-swapping a character or giving them a disability, these things on their own are not what makes a great story. We can have those deeper themes, we can have those strong messages that make us think and teach us a lesson, but this needs to be done authentically and not just for the sake of wokeness. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to hit the like button if you did. And tell me down in the comments, what are some things that you like or dislike about Marvel movies? Are you gonna go see The Marvels? Leave a comment down below, make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one, and I'll see you very soon with another new episode of Daniel Speaks.